the Extinction DTP's seminar series. And the session, just to let you know, the session is being recorded. And I'm going to share my screen and just show you the CELCI website in case you're not familiar with it. So CELCI is the Center for Endangered Languages, Cultures and Ecosystems. And it's co-directed by Janet Watson and myself. And it's a center without walls. So we have lots of things going on. It originated from Janet's work in Southern Arabia.
Sorry, John, are you sharing screen?
I am sharing my screen. Can you see it?
No, I don't think you are sharing it.
It says it. It says
I can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, I'm able to see it as well.
My computer. Okay, fine. Sorry.
That's okay, Janet. It's all recorded, so we'll be able to. CELCI's been hosting seminars for a while, and the recordings are on the YouTube channel. So if you're interested in the different CELCI seminars, then you can go back and see the recordings there. So without any further ado, we'll hand over to Ali to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to Helen Roy. I realise I erred in that I hadn't asked Helen if it was okay to record her seminar, so I'm very sorry I forgot to do that. Is it okay, Helen?
It's absolutely okay because Andrew had asked me.
Andrew, that's okay. Otherwise, I was really putting you on the spot in front of
No, not at all. I'd been asked. It's good. Thank you.
Sorry about that. So I'd like to introduce Helen Roy, Professor Helen Roy, MBE. She works at the Biological Records Centre at NERC's Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. She says she's interested in long-term and large-scale data sets around environmental change and invasive species. She's also interested in ladybirds. And she also does some great work on engaging people working across different disciplines and a lot of citizen science. And Helen's very involved in policy, and I think she'll talk to us a bit today about the global assessment of invasive alien species for the panel on biosecurity, Intergovernmental panel on biodiversity. I'm going to say biosecurity, got it on the brain. What we've suggested is that people feel free to put your hands up as Helen goes along. But if we go a little bit too much off at tangent, I'll try and pull us back along. And Helen, if you feel that we're having a lovely chat, but you're going to not get through your slides, maybe you need to sort of nudge as well, if that's okay. But do feel free to put your hands up and ask questions as well. I think Cicely already is. Oh, she stopped.
Great. Thank you very much, Ali.
Okay, so Helen, would you like to share your slides? Thank you.
Right. Can you see my slides, and are they on full screen?
Yes, I can certainly see your slides. I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to be able to see everybody's got their hands up because only a few people.
Yeah, of course. Well, yes, that's right. We only can see a few people. Well, we'll manage. Perhaps people will just shout if they.
Yes, people may have to do that if they feel we're ignoring you. That's what that's about.
I'd be very happy to be interrupted. It will be absolute pleasure to chat more. And I'm also really aware that there are many people with many different backgrounds, and I'm very much an ecologist. And so if I stray into ecological jargon of any kind that is seeming completely nonsensical, don't hesitate to stop me, and I'll try and make more sense. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all today. And I've put together this talk and sort of woven together a whole variety of different ideas, so I hope it's going to be okay. And I think that's why it doesn't matter if we stop and start at any particular point, because we can pick up at various stages throughout it. It doesn't have to be in a sort of linear fashion in any way whatsoever. But overall, I'm going to be talking about biological invasions, introducing you to biological invasions, and specifically thinking about work that I and many others have been doing to make predictions about biological invasions to help prevent extinctions. but also I'm going to talk about other aspects of the impacts that these biological invasions have other than extinctions, but I will have some sort of focus around extinctions. So I'm from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, and this is a research centre within the UK. We have 4 sites, one in Lancaster, one in Edinburgh, one in Bangor, and I'm based at the one in Wallingford, just south of Oxford. And I've said this is a talk by me, but it's a talk by many, many more as well. And I could have filled the screen with many, many people. And I'm pleased that Laurie's here and also Ali is here, because they don't need a picture here. I've worked with them both and collaborated extensively with them. And I think probably the main message throughout my talk will be the importance of these collaborations, the importance of bringing people together from a lot of different places with a lot of different ideas to be able to come up with solutions to what are really complex environmental issues. And I don't believe we can get there without engaging many, many people from many different backgrounds, sharing their incredible ideas. So this is a huge thank you to all of my collaborators. So I'm based within the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology within a group called the Biological Record Centre. And the Biological Record Centre is a really exciting place to be as someone like me who's interested in all things that creep and crawl. I have a particular passion for insects, and Ali's quite right, I have probably an obsession for ladybirds. And within the Biological Record Centre, we work with a lot of volunteers who are collating information, biological records they're called, occurrence information for a whole variety of species across the UK. And this kind of wheel in the centre shows many, many different taxonomic groups, including ladybirds and bees and earthworms and lichens and all kinds of things that people as volunteers are gathering information on and sharing. And they've been doing this for hundreds and hundreds of years. So we have these amazing long-term, large-scale data sets that we can use to address all kinds of questions. And I think you can go anywhere in the UK and there will be people who are interested in biological recording. And I think what's quite unique about our legacy of biological recording is just that huge diversity of species that people gather information about. So around the world, there might be various plant recording schemes, for instance, or butterfly recording schemes. But there aren't that many people who are recording soil invertebrates, for instance, around the world, little things that are involved in decomposition of leaf litter, for instance. And pretty much, if you were interested in a particular group of species, you would find someone else who is also interested in those. And that's what biological recording is all about. It's about that community engagement to gather this information on a whole variety of species. But we know that biodiversity is declining faster than at any other time in human history. And we know this from a whole variety of different assessments that have taken place. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services produced their global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services at the end of 2019. And it's this really stark report, actually, in many different ways, and the ways that people are affecting the world around them very, very dramatically. The State of Nature, which is a consortium of many different organizations and led by the RSPB, shows similar messages and shows a similar compilation of information and assessment of the state of nature across the UK. So one of the conclusions, one of the very stark conclusions from that global assessment, that 1 million species are facing extinction. I'm going to try and move that up. I can't see the top of my slides, but it's fine. I can manage. And this figure was put together through various sort of extrapolations by somebody called Andy Purvis, who is at the Natural History Museum. And he did a sort of almost back of the envelope calculation to come up with this figure, but it was very much an informed back of the envelope calculation. And he produced this really nice blog actually, because when this was first published, this assessment and this big statement about 1 million species at risk of extinction, he got a lot of challenges around that figure. And I think it's really well worth having a look at that, 1 million threatened species, 13 questions and answers, because he just talks through how he went through the process with his team of collaborators to come up with that figure. And I just put a few notes along the side here as to some of those kind of estimates that he made. Whatever the figure, it's a very big number. I think that's the important thing. So what's causing these declines? Well, we know there's, and this is quite a busy slide, but we know that there's these direct drivers, as we call them, that are causing biodiversity declines and ecosystem change. So we know that land and sea use change are having big effects. We know that the direct exploitation of species, for example, overfishing, that's having big effects. Climate change, of course, is often the sort of headline big driver of environmental change. Pollution, but also invasive alien species. So they're the 5 big drivers, if you like, of biodiversity change. But we know there's a whole suite of other indirect drivers going on: demographic, sociocultural, economic, technological, all kinds of things. And I think that that kind of interplay amongst those different drivers really demonstrates this importance of interdisciplinary working, of having this understanding across economies and society, but also integrating that alongside our understanding of biodiversity and ecosystems. So this talk is going to be very much focused on invasive non-native species, and I'm going to come through a definition of that in a moment. But I just thought I'd pull out the panel from the State of Nature that I already mentioned, where some of the information that we've compiled, there are 2,000 non-native species in Britain that are established. So that is 2,000 species that are reproducing and sustaining their populations year on year. Every year, we see about 10 new species established just in the UK. And of all of these invasive non-native species, about 12% cause some kind of problem, some kind of impact. So just to run through these definitions, and I think definitions are really important, and I think they are particularly important when we come to work across disciplines or to be combining data sets from all around the world. It's important that we're thinking along the same lines as one another and that we're using these same definitions. And non-native or alien, they're used interchangeably. Alien is more commonly used, the words alien species are more commonly used across the whole of Europe. But in Britain, we tend to use more the phrase non-native species. There are other terms like exotic species, non-indigenous, all kinds of terms that are used. And certainly none of them are perfect and none of them are without contention of one reason or another. But essentially, when we're talking about non-native species or alien species from an ecological perspective, we're talking about species that have been introduced from one part of the world where they naturally occur to another part of the world outside of that natural or native range by humans. And it's that human activity that's really important. It's our part that we're playing in this movement of species. So we know that species have moved around the world forever. But what's happening now is we've got an increased and accelerated rate, and that species are moving over greater distances. And they can do this because we as humans are moving around the world more, and we're transporting goods from further afield. So that human part is really, really critical within this definition. And when we're speaking about the whole of all the non-native species, so for example, there's 2,000 non-native species within Britain, there are species such as this little ladybird, Hennesopelagna argus. So actually, it's not that little, it's quite a big ladybird. It's a very cute ladybird. It's quite fuzzy. It only feeds on white bryony, doesn't cause anyone any concerns at all, causes people like me utter joy because I can go and visit it in a car park in Guildford, and increasingly there's the slow spread of it. It was discovered by a young child actually in a back garden in Surrey, and just on that map there, I don't know how clear it is for you, but you can, that's its current distribution. It's not spread very far at all, and it was first recorded in the mid-1990s, so it's been around for quite a while, but it just feeds on white bryony and is a delightful ladybird. And that's a little larva that you can see to the left of it, which is, I think you'll all agree, utterly adorable. A subset of all of these non-native species cause some kind of problem. So I think that's a really important thing to remember, that a lot of these non-native species don't do a great deal at all, and some of them may be beneficial, but there are a subset that threaten biodiversity, ecosystems, or the way we live. And I'll see if I can get this animation working. So this is another ladybird. This is the Harlequin ladybird. I'm not sure the animation is going to work. You would have seen an explosion across the map of the spread of the Harlequin ladybird if that had decided to work. Let's see if it will work if I get back up. No. So this is a Harlequin ladybird. It's a species of ladybird that is native to quite a broad area within Asia. And it was introduced into many countries around the world as a biological control agent to feed on pest insects such as aphids. And it was first introduced into America back in 1916, and it didn't do very much other than be quite an effective biological control agent to pest insects. And so in the 1980s, it was introduced into many countries across Europe. And it was at that time that in America, they began to see that there were some it was beginning to spread and that there were some impacts. It's a large generalist predator. It's a top predator. It feeds on a lot of other insects besides the pest insects for which it was introduced. And so we have concerns over the threat it might pose to biodiversity. And if that map had worked, it's always normally worked, so I don't know why it's not now, you would have seen the spread all across the country very, very rapidly from the first record in 2004. It spread at about 80 kilometers a year after the first arrival. So that's a huge contrast to that briny ladybird that I showed you on the previous slide. So they're the definitions. Non-native species is the large number of all the species that be moved by humans from one part of the world to another. And the invasive species are that small component that cause some kind of problem.
What's going on in that lovely picture on the bottom right?
Just here?
Yeah.
So that's an adult ladybird just emerged from its pupa. Yes, I should. So these are the little larvae, which do look very cute when they're first coming out of their eggs. So the ladybird, the adult lays her eggs in a cluster, and then the little larvae hatch after about 5 days. And they go through some stages of development. They get bigger and bigger, and then they pupate, just like a butterfly pupates. And in that bottom picture, that is a newly emerged Harlequin ladybird sitting on their pupal case, and they do that to kind of for their wing cases and all of their body parts to kind of harden off after they've come out of that kind of pupal soup, so shall we say, and then they begin their life cycle again. And that's what's incredible about this ladybird, the Harlequin ladybird. It just keeps reproducing, it has incredible reproductive capacity. So I think it's like, of course, good to look at other species other than ladybirds. And this is a species called Hottentot fig, and maybe people have seen it on dune systems around the UK. And on the left-hand side, that's a picture that I took in South Africa. And that little bit of Hottentot fig in its native range was surrounded by penguins, and a very, very different system to the Hottentot fig on the right-hand side of that picture, which is on the Newquay dune systems down in Cornwall. And it literally is a monoculture. And I think even when you just look at what's happening above the ground with a species like that and think, gosh, it's covered a huge swathe of land, just picture what might be happening below the ground. Its footprint will be even bigger, and it's changing that whole dune system as a consequence of its arrival. So just to go back to ladybirds, and I won't keep going on about ladybirds, but one of the things that we need to do is gather more information about the interactions that these species have with other species when they arrive in these new places. And because we've got these long-term, large-scale data sets within the Biological Records Centre, we were able to look at what effect is the harlequin having on the distribution of native ladybirds. So we looked at these 8 native ladybirds, and 7 of the 8 were showing strong declines that were correlated with the arrival of the harlequin ladybird. And I just pull out the top corner one because that's the 2-spot ladybird. And when I was a child, that was a species that was incredibly widespread. I would have been seeing it all of the time. And it's had about a 44% decline in distribution as a consequence of the arrival of the harlequin ladybird. The harlequin outcompetes it for its food source, it eats it, and the 2-spot ladybird is not thriving in the company of the harlequin ladybird, and it has become a species that we really don't see reported very often at all now. And it's not just the case that that's happening in the UK, it's also happening in many other countries where the harlequin has arrived and lives alongside the two-spot ladybird. But I think what's really important as well, when we think about, so we may be seeing some kind of local extinctions perhaps of that two-spot ladybird, but we're not seeing total extinction of it, and I wouldn't imagine that we will. But one of the things that is really important to think about, I think, and I'm really fascinated by the interactions among species, but I'm also fascinated by the interactions amongst people and species, and people and landscapes, and people and the natural world. And I went to a talk by somebody called Pedro Giordano and was really inspired around the idea of his concerns over the extinction of ecological interactions, so that when species become in such a low number, they just don't have that same probability of interacting with the other species that they might have around them. And the whole kind of change to those ecological networks that take place is something that we really need to do better at understanding in order to be able to really know, so what would be the impact of the two-spot ladybird being in very low numbers now? Does it make any difference whatsoever to the functioning of our ecosystems? And that little picture to the bottom left is a stylized network. And I just put up these papers because I really like them, Chasing Ecological Interactions and Beyond Species Loss. The extinction of ecological interactions in the changing world. And some of the species in that network will be really important species, so-called performing keystone interactions, where they might be controlling some aspect of the ecosystem function at a higher extent than would be predicted by their abundance. So some of the species are more important in that network than others in terms of the functioning of that network. And these are the kind of things that we need to unravel if we're going to have a better understanding of what effects alien species or non-native species are going to have within these complex systems. And they are really complex systems. And so I just put up this paper as well, and I'm going to start to focus down on islands a little bit, because one of the places where we're particularly concerned about extinctions as a consequence of invasive alien species is on islands. And I also wanted to bring disease in quite early on to yes, so that I'd make Ali smile. And one of the things that is, at the moment, with sort of ecological network analysis, there are a lot of theories, there's a lot of thinking, there's not so much of the empirical evidence, but there's been some lovely studies on the Galapagos Islands looking at pollination networks and resolving whole networks, which species is interacting with which species and where are all of those species from. And this paper shows that there are these modules, these different colored parts of the network, and they're comprising 60 plants and there are 220 pollinators. And some of them are very important and some of them are less important, but alien links are about a third of the links within that network are now made up of alien species. So you can't really see it very clearly, and you can't really see it very clearly in the paper either, but the red lines are the alien links, and underneath there's a sort of sea of grey of the native species linking. But that's quite a dramatic change to that network. And then there's been some really beautiful detailed studies looking at, well, are these species interchangeable? Does it really matter what the origin of that species is? And actually they're showing that yes, it does matter. Some of these aliens are very generalist and they're not necessarily performing that sort of nuanced role that some of the specialist species might be performing. And they're also beginning to show that there's a link with disturbance. So it's not just about the alien species, it's about interactions with the degradation of the land, for instance. So it's just some really beautiful detailed studies on these important islands, showing how these interactions are changing over time. And we just recently published a paper in ecography through a cost action that I'm part of. It's a European network, and looking at, can we involve people, engage citizen scientists in understanding and recording interactions, because we have a lot of occurrence data of this species is found in this place at this particular time by this person, but it would be really great if we knew, well, what is that species doing and what is it interacting with, so that we can begin to build up those networks. And then when we're thinking just about pollinators, I think this is a lovely citizen science study. This is a huge bumblebee. So in Chile, they just have one bumblebee. I don't know if people are aware, but in the UK, we have about 24 species of bumblebee. You could commonly see quite a few different species of bumblebee in a back garden across most of England, and probably quite far into Scotland and Wales as well. But in Chile, they just have this one amazing and beautiful bumblebee. But this one bumblebee, this one native bumblebee that they have, is being threatened by the introduction of one of our bumblebees, Bombus terrestris, which has been introduced as a pollinating insect to enhance pollination of crops. But unfortunately, it's carrying some parasites and pathogens that are threatening this native bee. So people there have set up this inspiring citizen science project to track their native bumblebee. And we went over this. This is Pete Brown actually is in this picture with two of our collaborators, Audrey and Tanya in Chile. They run a ladybird survey. Pete and I run the UK ladybird survey together. And so we went to go and share ideas, and we would have been delighted to see this bumblebee, but we didn't see the bumblebee. But we can see dramatic losses in many different taxonomic groups. We know that amphibians are really suffering worldwide because of a little fungus that causes an infection on their skin, and we're seeing huge catastrophic losses, and some very stark figures from this fairly recent paper from a couple of years ago showing the numbers or proportions of extinctions over the last half century because of this fungal disease just spreading around the world. So actually, this is a paper that Ali and I worked on, and we were really mindful. Things like that little fungus killing the amphibians, we knew about that. We'd also heard about things like ash dieback and concerns over the ways in which our woodlands might change as a consequence of this newly arriving fungus. So we thought, well, it would be really great if we can make some predictions about what might be the next pathogens on the horizon that we should be really worried about, and maybe enhancing biosecurity to control in one way or another. And so we gathered a group of experts together. We gathered vets together, plant pathologists, insect pathologists, people who work on vectors of disease, insect vectors of disease. And we all came together to try and think about the different systems that we work on, and can we make some predictions? And basically the answer was no, we couldn't. The knowledge gaps were so vast that we couldn't even begin to think what is going to be the next threat. And so actually the most useful thing we could do was come up with what are the opportunities for us to increase our knowledge and understanding, such that in the future we can make better predictions around these pathogens. But I think this is just to sort of show how complex things are. We know that these pathogens and their hosts aren't acting in isolation. They're often interacting with a whole host of other species, and those other species are interacting with their wider landscape, and those wider landscapes are being changed by environmental change, including the arrival of invasive alien species, which is changing those whole dynamics of those cascades of parasites and pathogens. And then we know that there's a whole suite of policies and stakeholders who are interacting with that whole process. So that importance of bringing society and ecology together. And there's quite a lot of talk around One Health initiatives around the fact that we need to better join up human health, environmental health, animal health, so that we can actually begin to make a difference in terms of reducing the threat of parasites and pathogens, not only on humans, not only on domesticated animals, but also on wildlife as well. And I just thought I would bring in a fairly recent, this was just a policy note that I just saw that was just out now, that has been translated from this paper on looming extinctions due to invasive species. And really, it's just all about the lags in our system. So we already know of some documented extinctions as a consequence of the arrival of invasive alien species, particularly on islands. But what this paper is saying is that there's a lag effect, that we know that there's kind of an invasion debt, if you like, and we're likely to see more going through into the future. So I just thought it's very topical, and it's interesting to see how this paper has been converted into this sort of policy note, and it's just out now. One of the other things that I think that is really important is that we gather knowledge and information from a whole variety of systems. So it's really wonderful that we have these detailed pollinator networks from the Galapagos Islands that some natural historians and ecologists have compiled and diligently made those observations. But there's information that comes in a whole variety of different guises. And through the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, I've had my first experiences of knowledge coming from indigenous peoples and local communities. And it's just incredible to think the extra information that we can get by all coming together and sharing what it is that we know, whether we be an ecologist working in the Galapagos Islands or an indigenous local person who's got generations of storytelling that tell them about the land change and about species changes over time. And so there was this really lovely booklet published by CABI, which gives some really great examples of the narratives that come and the success stories in terms of local management. And I think that brings me to another point about all of this, that there's these questions of scale. So often when we hear about the big extinction, 1 million species globally going to go extinct, it's often kind of global scales. But some of these things are really impacting people at a very local scale, and getting some kind of understanding at those different levels is really critical. So coming back to the UK, we've been documenting biological invasions here for quite some time, alongside those long-term and large-scale data sets. And every year we produce a scorecard for DEFRA in terms of the species that we have at the moment. So we're constantly updating this database. And you can see that our 2,000 species is really dominated by plants, and animals make up a much, much smaller proportion. But if we look at those that are impactful, then only about 7% of the plants have an impact, whereas about a third of the animals have some kind of impact. So we can see that not all of the aliens are the same. They have lots of different traits that contribute to the outcomes of their invasion process. And every year we contribute to the UK biodiversity indicators, and we produce the trends over time, and we see the numbers are going up year on year in freshwater, marine and terrestrial environments. And we can look at that globally. And Hanno Siebens, an amazing scientist from Austria, has compiled these kind of databases like our one in GB for all around the world. And we can see the same pattern of the numbers going up over time. And there's no sign of slowing. I think that's a really important part as well. So it's all very well that we document all of these biological invasions, but what are we doing about it? And actually, if we want to do something about it, the best thing we can probably do is prevent the arrival in the first place, because once a species has arrived, it can be very difficult to control, verging on impossible, and can be very, very expensive. So we've been carrying out a variety of different horizon scanning projects. This is essentially sort of looking at what are the potential threats and opportunities within a given context. And this context being invasive alien species in, for example, what might be the next species that could arrive in Britain and pose a threat to biodiversity, or which could be the next species to arrive somewhere in the European Union. So we've been carrying out this horizon scanning exercise at a whole variety of different scales to make predictions about biological invasions, to think about which species do we need to prioritize to get more information through risk assessments, which ones do we need to just implement some monitoring and action around immediately. And I'm going to go back to talking about the islands. We carried out this horizon scanning project in Britain and then across the EU. And then I was really fortunate to have some funding to look across all of the UK overseas territories. And I'm probably really quite ashamed to say, I didn't know a huge amount about our UK overseas territories. I probably couldn't have drawn them all on a map, that's for sure. So these are all of the territories that the UK is overseeing in some way or another. And you can see a cluster in the Caribbean, the Middle Atlantic, the South Atlantic, over in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean with the Pitcairn and Gibraltar, and then also Cyprus with Aquiterian Decalia. So we carried out this horizon scanning on, they're mainly islands, those UK overseas territories, and we know that islands represent about 5.3% of the Earth's landmass, but they hold a huge amount of our biodiversity. And as far as the UK is concerned, if we were to do a biodiversity inventory for the UK, the overseas territories would be having far more species diversity than we have in mainland Britain. And we know that invasive alien species, about 86% of recorded extinctions on islands are linked to invasive alien species. So we know that they're particularly problematic on islands. So we carried out this horizon scanning, first of all, on the Cyprus sovereign base area. So I'm really now going to just show you some beautiful pictures of islands. So you can kind of take this as your sort of break and just enjoy the pictures and think about sunny places. And some of this work was funded by directly from the UK government, and some was funded through the Darwin Initiative. So this is Grand Cayman. And underneath that car, you can see a green iguana. When we were there in 2018, and this process, we work with many people within the territories to do this work. This green iguana, there were about 1 million individuals. They escaped from, their pets escaped and have reproduced very successfully on Grand Cayman. Their numbers double approximately every year. So we were there in 2018. The following year, there would have been 2 million. They have got a very active eradication program at the moment, but green iguanas are still very much there. And one of the issues around the green iguana is they have a blue iguana on the Cayman Islands, and that species is not found anywhere else in the world. It's endemic to the Caymans, and the green iguana is threatening that species. So that's an example where you could have an extinction driven because of that arrival of the species. And on that beach is an invasive seaweed, a sargassum, that's causing quite a lot of problems as well. This is St. Helena, and this is an amazing and beautiful place. And you can see the swathe of this spiky vegetation through what was a cloud forest. And this is New Zealand flax. It was introduced to make rope for rope industry, and it's really just covered large parts of St. Helena. What's really inspiring there, though, is that they are clearing it and they are reintroducing some of the plants that only occur there, some of the endemic plants. And what they're seeing is the recovery of some of the endemic insects. So there is real hope, there is real optimism. And it's amazing to go somewhere like this and see those projects in action. This is the British Indian Ocean Territory, Diego Garcia, really beautiful beach. Again, a place that's so remote, yet so many invasive alien species. So looking across all of these different island groups, we were able to see some of the species that crop up time and time again. Mussels cause a lot of problems within the marine environment and also the freshwater environments as well. This little fire ant just came up time and time again. And for a little ant, you may well be thinking, well, what problems could that possibly cause? It will drive people off their agricultural land because it is such an aggressive little ant and occurs in such very high numbers, and its stings are extremely painful. So across all the different environments, we see lionfish, and there's mosquitoes. The brown rats cause a lot of problems, particularly to seabird colonies. And this is a very complex figure, so I won't talk about it very long, but it's just to say that these species are arriving in a lot of different ways and having a lot of different impacts. And so all of these bars show different ways in which they could arrive in these different places. And containers, so ships with containers, when they open the containers, different things could just run out, basically. And so that biosecurity around the containers, and ideally opening them offshore, can make a really big difference. We got stranded on St. Helena, which was a real pleasure, actually, but for a whole week, a plane couldn't land to come back and collect us. And so we helped out with some of the biosecurity, and it was really wonderful to stand across these tables and chat to people who are really protecting that environment by screening all of the produce that comes in. And this is on a sort of concrete harbour, a little peninsula on the island, so they can intercept before it gets further afield into the island. I'm not sure we were very helpful, but that people were very obliging to us to be there with them, and it was fascinating to see the work. I'm just going to finish with talking about a little bit about some of the other work that we've been doing, following on from coming up with these biosecurity lists, these horizon scanning lists. We've then been looking at how species might spread between different islands. So, for example, between islands within the Caribbean, and what kind of local action could take place to prevent the spread. The green iguana is a story that's going to keep coming up. The green iguana is now in Anguilla as well as on the Cayman Islands. They're moving all of their endemic, so their iguana that only occurs there on Anguilla, each of the islands has their own endemic iguanas. They're moving them all to a new island so that, because they just can't do anything about the green iguana and they're so threatened. So all they can do is create a reserve on one of their off-island islands, if you like. And these iguanas are coming across on debris, for instance, on floating debris they've been seen to come across. They're not only on pet escapes, but they're then spreading from those places to others of the islands. And so there's a lot of work needed to be done if they're going to be able to protect the endemic iguanas on Anguilla, and similarly on Turks and Caicos. So this is the Turks and Caicos endemic rock iguana. So I'm just going to come back to Britain for the closing slides and to citizen science. And one of the species that we predicted would arrive back when we did the first horizon scanning back in 2013 was the Asian hornet. It wasn't particularly clever of us to make the prediction. It had already arrived and spread across France very, very rapidly. And so DEFRA funded us to set up a citizen science project, Asian Hornet Watch, and we have an email system and all kinds of ways in which people can report their sightings. And you can see on that figure, the graph, the line graph, we get thousands and thousands of reports every year of what people think are an Asian hornet. Thankfully, every year, it's only a couple of actual Asian hornets. Mostly, it's another hornet, the European hornet and native hornet within the UK. We've done a lot of publicity and promotion to get people recording what they think they're seeing and to let us know. And as a consequence, this is the Asian hornet, Vespa velutina. It's a terrestrial predator. It feeds a lot on honeybees, but there's also concerns over it feeding on some of our wild bees as well. And a completely random event as to how it arrived in France, just in some pottery into Bordeaux in 2004. Because we've had this active program of citizen science and reporting, there have been records every year since 2016, and every year eradication has taken place. So far it's a species that has been successfully managed. So one of the things we're doing, going back to the overseas territories, is thinking about how we can build capacity in terms of citizen science and engaging people in recording within these overseas territories. And whereas we have this rich history and legacy of volunteer recording within the UK, that's not the same on all of the territories. But there's a huge willingness and awareness and people wanting to get involved, and so we're working to share ideas, to share infrastructures, to share things that we've developed, and also learning a lot from people there along the way. So we mentioned right at the beginning the Intergovernmental Panel on Ecosystem Services and on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and the assessment that's happening at the moment is a global assessment involving many, many experts from around the world, bringing in these different knowledge systems. And it's open for external review at the moment. So if you have an idle moment, you could go and register as an external reviewer on the IPBES website and take a look at where we've got to so far with this assessment. And it is interdisciplinary. So there is something there, I hope, for everybody. So just to summarize, I think that making predictions about biological invasions is very important in informing action. But collaborations and partnerships are absolutely critical to address these big global environmental issues, also to overcome knowledge gaps and also to have local relevance. But it's really important that we embrace the complexity of these systems, that we do think about pathogens, that we think about the extinction of interactions, that we take whole systems approaches. And it's really important that we engage people across the board in conservation, because there isn't necessarily only one right answer in conservation. And actually the important role that people play in that decision making can only take place if they are informed and if they are excited by the subject and that they get involved. And there's a lot of joy to engaging people within biodiversity and ecosystem research. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you again to all my amazing collaborators. This panel of photos is from the territories and all the people we worked with within those territories through these expert elicitation workshops, and they were just inspiring. And I have learned so much as a consequence of having the privilege of working alongside them. So thank you very much.